Although it's fallen from the headlines at most Western news outlets, there continues to be mass atrocities, suicide bombings, and warring factions in Syria, among them child soldiers recruited by the Islamic State. I'm now joined by Anna Neistat, Senior Director of Research for Amnesty International. She has spent considerable time in Moscow, and her human rights work was featured in the award-winning documentary E-Team. She grew up in Moscow. She joins us from London. Anna, many human rights tragedy in the world. We're going to talk about Syria. Bring us up to date. What is happening in Syria right now?
Well, I'm very glad, Larry. Thank you very much that you're bringing it back to light, because indeed it's turning into one of those forgotten conflicts, while in reality people are being killed every day as we speak. And I believe just last week the number of refugees has reached over 4 million people. It's one of the biggest refugee crises. The number of people who are in need and assistance because they have been deprived of everything is reaching 15 million. So we are talking about a major armed conflict, ongoing armed conflict with various parties involved, and various parties involved in war crimes and crimes against humanity, as we have documented, but also a massive humanitarian catastrophe that is fading away from the front pages more and more, unfortunately.
Why?
I think it's a combination of fatigue. I'm sure you've known for years, the longer the crisis continues, the less journalists and others are interested in covering it. But partially, I think it's helplessness. There have been many questions as to what to do with Syria. They have been asked over the last 4 years. Nobody have come up with a good answer. And right now, I think it's even harder to find an answer. And even those players who have been interested, say US or France, in finding an answer, are now facing a very different level and combination of threats. So it's avoidance in some ways.
You recently posted a blog. You titled it, "No Excuse for Failing Syria." How have we failed?
Well, I think we failed at the first place to recognize what the conflict was all about. And in some ways we failed, we as in Western world, I would say, failed to, as often happens, to resist Russia's bullying, and to a certain extent Iran's, but Russia is at the first place. Let's just remember very quickly that when the conflict started, it was really about peaceful protesters and then so-called Free Syrian Army, so very moderate secular opposition that was opposing a dictatorial government. And that was the moment for action, for support. And when that failed, eventually we started sliding further and further into what we're facing right now with Islamic State and other radical groups running the show. And back then it was a combination of various red lines that were never acted upon. And of course, Russia vetoing every single resolution attempted at the international level.
Why is Russia so allied with Assad?
It's a good question. I think the official line is that Syria essentially remains one of Russia's only remaining allies in the region, and they do need this support. It is to a certain extent a military partner. Syria has been buying lots of Russian weaponry. But I always think that there is a deeper answer to that. And this answer is fairly existential. If you think of who's in power in Russia right now, for Mr. Putin to allow the thought that a popular uprising can topple somebody like Assad is just beyond his reality. It's really something that he cannot accept by any means, because that would mean that his own power might be in question.
Now, tell me about these children. 50 children soldiers recruited by the Islamic State have been killed. Children soldiers, what age children? How are they recruited?
We have not investigated this case directly, so I really don't want to spread rumors, but we were aware, of course, of what's been in the public domain. It doesn't necessarily surprise me, given all of the atrocities that have been committed by the Islamic State to date. I don't, unfortunately, have a lot of details about this case, but again, given all of the executions that have been committed so far, it's yet another atrocity in line of many committed by the Islamic State in Syria and in other countries like Iraq.
Now, what about the United States? What have we done? What haven't we done?
I think United States had not have a very good strategy on Syria since the very beginning. And here I'm talking, I would say, from experience of talking to American diplomats and those who are involved in shaping the American politics over the last 4 years. Since the very beginning, there wasn't a clear strategy. It was not clear what to do. And as a result, there was too much delay in any kind of action. At some point, the United States started supporting the opposition, but in a very limited way, and without, again, having a strategy as to how to rebuild, for example, a state on the territories that have been taken over by the opposition forces. And of course, it did not help to set up red lines and then do nothing when these red lines have been crossed.
Why is Assad still in power?
I think Assad is still in power due to support, political support that he gets from Russia and military support that he gets from Russia. And also, we shouldn't forget that Iran has been extremely supportive of the regime because, again, it's a bigger game with Saudi Arabia and Iran involved in the picture. But right now, I think he's getting stronger, or at least harder to defeat, because of the rise of the Islamic State. Now that you have this new power or the new player in the picture that everybody is so concerned about, and the American international attacks are targeted against, that obviously gives him more and more time in power.
You worked for Human Rights Watch prior to joining Amnesty International. In an interview, you pointed to Amnesty International as a massive grassroots movement, and that you are interested in looking into the potential of a popular mobilization. Do you see the possibility of a popular mobilization helping the situation in Syria?
To a certain extent. And I always say that, as much as I'm attracted to the idea of popular mobilization, it remains to be just one of the tools at our disposal. We, in every situation, use a combination of research and media exposure and targeted advocacy and campaigning mobilization. So for Syria, it also has to be a combination of those. But I'll give you just one example. Amnesty recently launched a campaign called Open to Syria. And that was all about resettlement of Syrian refugees, because one of the biggest problems right now, as I mentioned in the beginning, is the problem of refugees, millions of refugees fleeing from Syria, the vast majority of whom are housed, settled only by the neighboring countries, Lebanon, Turkey, and Jordan. Europe, United States, the Gulf have not taken almost any refugees. Literally, we're talking about 0.5%. And we are mobilizing people at Amnesty to actually open their hearts, open their minds to Syrian refugees, and lobby their governments to be more open to resettlement of those most vulnerable, women, children, people who are sick, people who need particular assistance. And that is working quite well.
How did you come, Anna, personally, you grew up in Moscow in the 80s, to choose this career for yourself?
Well, I think it's a combination of coincidence and not, like everything in life. I think the reason, part of the reason, is because I grew up in what used to be Soviet Union and had the privilege to witness a massive totalitarian system crumbling and eventually crashing in front of my eyes. And I think that's the impression that motivated me throughout my life. I saw that change is possible. And then it was just the question of finding a career where I can ensure or contribute to this change elsewhere. And I have to say, I haven't regretted it since.
You were pregnant with your second child on one of your trips to Syria. The father, your second husband, is involved in human rights investigation too. How do you combine the two of being a mother and an investigator?
Well, it's a hard question, and of course, it's a lot of logistics. I think in some ways it's good that we're both in the same line of work because we understand each other very well. But partially, I think it's just recognizing that there is no such thing as being a perfect mother. Or a father for that matter. I think there are certain things we don't give our children, such as, regular routine and regular lunch served at home. But at the same time, we give them something else, which I hope is recreating what my parents gave me, the sense that the happiness in life is having something to do that you really love, that you're really committed to, having a career, having a profession that is not just a job, going to work happy and feeling that you're doing something meaningful. And I think no matter how much our children might complain that we're not home enough, they do grow up with this sense. I mean, our oldest son, our teenager, does say that he has the coolest parents in the world, and I think there is no better award than this, hearing something like this from your teenager.
Can the social media world, can the technology advancements help in this Syrian question?
They do, and in fact, we are using more and more innovation and technology in our work. The human rights research has changed dramatically even since I joined this profession, but apparently, especially compared to what it used to be, say, 30 years ago, we don't just talk to people anymore. We really each investigation that we conduct is a combination of interviewing witnesses and victims and perpetrators, but also using things like satellite imagery. And we do it a lot in Syria, for example, to show destruction in particular areas. We do a lot of video verification because on one hand, the idea of citizen journalism is great and is helping us a lot. But on the other hand, when we get hundreds of videos from a location in Syria, we cannot use them directly in investigations. We need to have tools for verifying them. But we also, we have to develop ways of remote sensing, of doing investigations in places where we do not necessarily have direct access, because governments are also becoming increasingly sophisticated in preventing access and in hiding the truth.
Concerning Syria, Anna, do you see a light at the end of the tunnel?
Unfortunately, Larry, less and less so. I was quite hopeful in the beginning. I did not expect it to turn into such a prolonged and bloody conflict. I still think that a certain, for example, commitment to accountability, if suddenly tomorrow the world powers do come together and actually send a very strong message that Assad and other perpetrators of war crimes and crimes against humanity will face international tribunal, for example, could serve as a major deterrent. Investment in rebuilding in the areas that have been taken over by the moderate opposition could help. And of course, commitment to at least delivering on the resolutions that have been adopted, such as the resolution on humanitarian assistance, can at least alleviate the day-to-day suffering of people in Syria. But to be honest, it's a hope, but reality does not really support this hope of mine. And from what we're seeing right now, it's not getting any better.
Anna, I salute you for your work. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you very much, Harry. It's a pleasure.
Anna Neistat, Senior Director of Research for Amnesty International.